"Did you enjoy the lake house I gave you, Mom?" my son asked, smiling as he reached for another slice of turkey. And for a moment, I thought I had misheard him because nothing in my life over the past 2 years had resembled anything close to a lake house or even comfort, let alone a gift that grand. So I set my fork down slowly and looked at him across the table, really looked at him, trying to reconcile the confident, well-dressed man sitting in front of me with the boy I had once raised on second-hand clothes and careful budgeting. And I said, as evenly as I could, "What house, Daniel?" And the way his smile faltered, just slightly, told me everything I needed to know before another word was spoken, the room shifting in a way I could feel in my chest more than see, like the ground beneath me had quietly tilted and no one else had noticed yet. And for a few seconds, no one said anything, not even Victoria, who sat beside him in her cream-colored sweater that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her posture perfect, her expression carefully arranged. But her eyes, those eyes flickered, just for a fraction of a second, toward me and then away again, as if she had already calculated the distance between truth and denial and chosen her side. And I became suddenly aware of everything at once: the hum of the refrigerator in the background, the faint ticking of the clock above the sink, the smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon that I had worked so hard to prepare that morning, wanting everything to be just right for my son's visit. Because it had been 4 months since I had last seen him in person, for months of short phone calls and polite reassurances that he was busy, that business was good, that he would visit soon. And I had believed him. Of course I had. Because mothers don't question those things. Not when they've spent a lifetime believing that love means patience. But now, sitting there in my small dining room with the chipped edge on the table I kept meaning to fix and the draft that slipped in through the window every winter, I realized there was a version of my life that my son thought I was living, a version where I owned a lake house, where I received monthly support, where I was comfortable, maybe even happy. And that version was so far removed from the reality I had been quietly enduring that it almost felt like he was talking about someone else entirely, someone who had never had to choose between paying the electric bill and refilling a prescription, someone who didn't wear the same coat through 2 winters because replacing it simply wasn't an option. And I felt something settle inside me then. Not anger, not yet, but a clarity that cut sharper than either, because whatever this was, whatever had happened between what my son believed and what I had actually lived, it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a gap too wide to be accidental. And as Daniel leaned forward, confusion beginning to crease his forehead, opening his mouth to speak again, I already knew, with a certainty that came from years of quiet observation and unspoken patterns, that the truth had been sitting at this table long before I realized it, smiling politely, saying all the right things, and waiting for the moment it could no longer stay hidden. I had lived for 2 years in a version of life that my own son would not have recognized, and the realization settled over me as I sat there at the table, my hands resting quietly in my lap, while Daniel searched my face for an answer that I could not give him because there was nothing to explain, nothing to clarify, only the simple truth that I had never received anything he believed he had given me. And in that moment, memories began to rise one by one, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet persistence that made them impossible to ignore, like the winter 2 years ago when the heating unit failed during the coldest week of January, and I spent 3 nights sleeping in the living room with 2 blankets and a space heater that I turned off every few hours to save on electricity, telling myself it was temporary, that things would improve. Or the time I stood at the pharmacy counter holding my prescription in my hand, calculating whether I could afford the refill that month or, if I needed to stretch the remaining pills just a little longer, choosing instead to wait because the utility bill was already overdue. And through all of it, I never once considered that help had been sent and simply never reached me. Because that kind of thought does not come naturally to a mother who has spent her entire life trusting her family. And yet as I looked at Daniel now, the confusion on his face deepening, I realized that while I had been counting dollars and making quiet sacrifices, he had been living under the assumption that I was comfortable, supported, even cared for in ways that had never actually touched my life. And the distance between those two realities felt larger than any physical distance we had ever had between us. I thought of the worn coat hanging by the door that I had patched twice myself, The groceries I had stretched into meals that lasted longer than they should have. The birthdays and holidays spent alone with a phone that rarely rang. And none of those things matched the picture he seemed to carry in his mind. A picture where his mother was safe and provided for, where his efforts had made a difference. And I wondered then, not with anger, but with a slow, steady clarity, who had been standing in the space between us, who had taken something meant for me and quietly redirected it without a single word. And my eyes shifted, almost without intention, toward Victoria, who was now sitting very still, her fingers curled gently around the edge of her glass. Her posture unchanged, but her silence louder than anything she could have said. And I noticed the smallest details, the way she avoided looking directly at me, the way her attention seemed fixed on the table rather than the conversation unfolding around her. And it was in those small, almost invisible moments that the shape of the truth began to form, not as a sudden revelation, but as a pattern that had been there all along, waiting for me to see it. Because nothing about my life over the past 2 years had been random, nothing about the missed calls, the distance, the careful explanations from Daniel about how busy he was. None of it existed in isolation, and now, sitting at that table on Thanksgiving Day, I could feel those pieces slowly coming together, aligning into something I could no longer dismiss as coincidence. And as Daniel reached for his phone, his movements quick and unsettled as he began searching for something, perhaps proof, perhaps reassurance, I remained where I was, still and quiet, because for the first time in a long while, I was not trying to hold the family together or smooth over discomfort. I was simply watching, listening, and allowing the truth, whatever it was, to finally reveal itself. Daniel's fingers moved quickly across his phone screen, his brows drawn together in a way I had not seen since he was a boy trying to solve a problem he could not quite understand, and the silence in the room stretched thin, fragile, as if one wrong word might break something that could never be repaired. And I watched him carefully, not with urgency, not with desperation, but with a kind of stillness that came from knowing that whatever he found would not change what I had lived through it, would only confirm it. And after a few seconds, he let out a quiet breath and turned the screen toward himself again, scrolling, his jaw tightening slightly as he read. And then he said, more to himself than to me, "That is not possible." And I could hear the uncertainty in his voice, the first crack in the certainty he had carried into this room. And he began to speak again, explaining that everything had been handled professionally, that the paperwork had been completed, that the property had been transferred, that there were records, confirmations, emails, all the things that, in his world, meant something was real, meant something had been done correctly, and yet none of those things had ever reached me. None of them had touched my life in any way that mattered. And as he spoke, I found myself noticing how easily those words could exist without reality, how systems and confirmations and transactions could all move forward without ever truly arriving where they were meant to go. And my gaze shifted again, slowly, deliberately, to Victoria, who remained seated beside him, her back straight, her expression composed. But there was a tension in her hands now, a slight tightening of her fingers around the edge of the table that had not been there before. And when Daniel said her name, quietly at first, as if testing it in this new context, she looked up with a small, controlled smile that did not quite reach her eyes, and he asked her, carefully, whether she remembered anything about the arrangements, about the paperwork, about the details he had entrusted to her during that time. And for a moment, just a moment, there was hesitation, not long enough for someone who was not paying attention to notice, but long enough for me, because I had spent years learning how to read the spaces between words, the pauses that reveal more than any explanation ever could. And she answered in a calm voice, saying that everything had been taken care of, that perhaps there had been a delay, that sometimes these things happened, her tone smooth, practiced, almost reassuring. But there was something underneath it now, something that did not align with the situation unfolding in front of us. And Daniel looked at her, really looked at her, in a way that suggested he was seeing something for the first time, something he had overlooked before. And I could feel the shift happening, subtle but undeniable, as the certainty he had placed in her began to waver. And still, I did not speak. I did not interrupt, because there was power in allowing the truth to surface on its own, in letting the questions form naturally rather than forcing them. And as Daniel scrolled again, opening messages, searching through confirmations, his movements growing more urgent. I noticed how quiet Victoria had become, how she no longer offered explanations as quickly as before, how her eyes flicked briefly toward the hallway as if considering an exit that did not exist. And it was in that quiet, in that growing imbalance between what was being said and what was not, that the reality of the situation became impossible to ignore, not just for me, but for him as well. And I realized then that this moment, this slow unraveling, was not about confrontation or accusation. It was about recognition, about seeing clearly what had been hidden in plain sight. And for the first time since this conversation had begun, I felt something steady settle within me. Not relief, not yet, but a calm understanding that whatever came next, I would not be the one caught unprepared. The sound of Daniel's phone being set down on the table was softer than I expected, but it carried through the room with a weight that made everything else feel distant. And when he finally looked up, the certainty that had once defined his expression was gone, replaced by something far less stable, something searching, and he spoke more slowly now, as if each word required careful consideration, explaining that the deed had been transferred through his office, that the payments had been scheduled automatically, that everything had been handled in a way that left no room for error. And yet here I was, sitting across from him, living proof that something had gone very wrong. And I watched as he turned his attention fully to Victoria, no longer casually including her in the conversation, but directing his questions toward her with a quiet intensity that had not been there before, asking her to walk him through the process again, step by step, his voice steady but edged with something new, something that suggested he was no longer asking for confirmation but for truth. And Victoria shifted slightly in her seat, the first visible sign of discomfort she had allowed to surface, her shoulders tightening just enough to break the illusion of ease she had maintained until now. And she began to speak, her words measured, explaining that she had coordinated with his assistant, that she had ensured everything was sent, that there must have been some kind of mix-up, perhaps an issue with the mailing address or a delay in processing. Her explanation smooth, almost convincing, but there was a subtle inconsistency in the way she spoke, a hesitation that appeared and disappeared too quickly for someone untrained to notice. And I realized then that while she was accustomed to controlling conversations, she was not accustomed to being questioned in this way, not by him, not in front of me. And Daniel listened, but he did not interrupt. He did not nod along as he might have before. Instead, he held her gaze, waiting, and when she finished, he asked a simple question, one that did not sound complicated, but carried more weight than anything else he had said so far. He asked for specifics, for dates, for confirmations, for something concrete that could anchor her explanation in reality. And that was when the shift became undeniable, because Victoria, who had always been precise, always prepared, did not answer immediately, her eyes flickering briefly as if searching for something that was no longer within reach, and the silence that followed stretched just long enough to reveal what words could not. And I felt a quiet certainty settle deeper within me, not as a sudden realization, but as the final piece of a pattern that had been forming since the moment this conversation began. And I thought back to the past 2 years, to the small, seemingly insignificant moments that had never quite made sense, the times when Daniel would mention sending something that I never received, the occasions when Victoria would step in to clarify details that did not require clarification, the way communication had slowly shifted from direct conversations with my son to updates that passed through her first, as if she had positioned herself as the gatekeeper of everything that moved between us. And at the time, I had accepted it without question, because it seemed easier, because it felt normal. But now, sitting here, watching her struggle to maintain the narrative she had constructed, I understood that those moments had not been random. They had been part of something deliberate, something controlled, and Daniel seemed to understand it as well, though perhaps not fully yet, because the way he looked at her now was different, not accusatory, not yet, but no longer unquestioning. And as he reached for his phone again, opening another set of messages, his movements slower, more deliberate, I remained still, allowing the silence to do its work, because there was no need to rush this moment, no need to force it forward. The truth was already there, unfolding in the space between what had been said and what could no longer be explained. And for the first time in a long while, I felt no need to fill that space, No need to protect anyone from what was coming next. I simply watched, knowing that whatever happened from this point on would not be shaped by assumptions or misunderstandings, but by something far more difficult to ignore. Daniel's thumb hovered over the screen for a moment before he turned the phone toward himself again, his eyes scanning more carefully this time, slower, as if he was no longer looking for confirmation, but for inconsistencies, and I could see the shift happening not just in what he was reading, but in how he was reading it, his posture slightly forward, his attention narrowing, the way it used to when he was working through a difficult problem, and after a few seconds, he spoke again, this time with a different tone, one that carried less certainty and more calculation, saying that there were transfers, monthly ones, consistent, exact amounts, $1,500 each month, sent regularly over the past 2 years, and as he said the number out loud, I felt something settle heavily in my chest, not shock, because I had already understood what this meant, but a quiet acknowledgement of just how much had existed. Beyond my reach, $36,000. Enough to have changed everything about the way I had been living, enough to have replaced the heater, to cover my prescriptions without hesitation, to ease the constant calculations that had defined my days, and yet it had never arrived, not once, and Daniel looked up from the screen, his eyes moving between me and Victoria as if trying to reconcile two realities that could no longer exist together, and he asked, plainly now, whether I was certain, whether there was any chance I had missed something, overlooked something, perhaps forgotten a deposit or misunderstood a statement, and I shook my head, not quickly, not defensively, but with a calm certainty that came from living through every single day of those 2 years with careful attention, and I told him, quietly, that there had been no extra money, no unexpected deposits, nothing beyond what I earned and managed on my own, and the silence that followed was heavier this time, not fragile, but dense, as if it carried the weight of something undeniable, and Daniel turned to Victoria again, his expression no longer uncertain but searching, pressing now for answers that could not be explained away with generalities, asking her how the transfers had been handled, what account had been used, who had access, and Victoria's composure, which had held so firmly until now, began to shift in small, almost imperceptible ways, her shoulders tightening, her gaze dropping briefly, before returning, her voice still controlled but no longer effortless as she responded, saying that everything had been set up through his assistant, that she had only helped coordinate, that she had trusted the process, but there was a hesitation in her words now, a slight delay that had not been there before, and Daniel noticed it. I could see it in the way his eyes narrowed slightly, in the way he did not immediately accept her explanation, and instead of responding right away, he looked back at his phone, opening another message, another confirmation, and then he said something that changed the tone of the room entirely. He mentioned that the account listed in the transfer confirmations was not mine, that the routing information did not match anything he had on file for me, and for a brief moment, everything seemed to pause, as if the room itself had taken a breath and was waiting to see what would happen next, and I turned my head slightly, just enough to look at Victoria without making it obvious, and in that moment, I saw it. Not fear exactly, but something close to it, something that had replaced the careful control she had maintained until now, and it confirmed what I had already begun to understand, that this was not a misunderstanding, not an error, not something that could be corrected with a simple explanation. This was something intentional, something that had been maintained over time, and as Daniel slowly lowered his phone, his attention fixed entirely on his wife, the space between them filled with a tension that had not existed before. I remained where I was, still and quiet, because there was nothing left for me to prove, nothing left for me to question. The truth was no longer something I needed to uncover. It was something they were now forced to face. Daniel did not look at me when he spoke again, his eyes fixed on Victoria as if he was trying to see past the version of her he had trusted for years and into something he had never needed to question before, and his voice was quieter now, not raised, not angry, but controlled in a way that made every word land heavier than if he had shouted, and he asked her directly, without softening it, whose account the money had been going to, and for a moment, she did not answer, not immediately, and that hesitation, that small break in timing, was more revealing than anything she could have said, and I watched as she adjusted slightly in her chair, her fingers uncurling and then tightening again against the table, her gaze shifting briefly downward before returning to him. And when she finally spoke, her voice was still steady, but there was an effort behind it now. A careful construction rather than the effortless confidence she had carried before, and she said that there must have been some confusion with the accounts, that perhaps the assistant had used an intermediary account for transfers, that sometimes financial setups were more complex than they appeared, and her explanation was structured, almost rehearsed, but it lacked something essential, something that Daniel seemed to be searching for. Because he did not respond right away, he simply watched her, and the silence between them stretched, not uncomfortable in the way silence usually is, but deliberate, as if he was giving her the space to correct herself, to say something that aligned with the facts he was holding in his hand. And when she did not, when her explanation settled without fully landing, he spoke again, this time more precisely, mentioning the name on the account, reading it from his screen. And the moment that name left his lips, I saw the change in her expression, subtle, but unmistakable, a flicker that passed too quickly for someone unfamiliar with her to notice. But I had spent enough time observing people to recognize when something had been exposed, and Daniel saw it too. I could tell, because his posture shifted slightly, his shoulders straightening, his focus sharpening, and he asked her if she recognized the name, if it meant anything to her. And again, there was that pause, that fraction of a second where the answer did not come naturally. And when she responded, she said no, too quickly, too cleanly, as if the word had been chosen before the question was even finished, and it hung in the air, incomplete, unconvincing, and I felt something settle deeper inside me. Not anger, not even disappointment, but a quiet understanding that what we were witnessing was not a misunderstanding being clarified, but a structure being dismantled piece by piece. And Daniel seemed to reach the same realization, because he leaned back slightly, exhaling in a slow, controlled way, as if he was recalibrating. And then he said something that shifted the weight of the moment entirely. He said that the account was linked to her, that the records showed access, authorization, control, and he did not raise his voice when he said it. He did not accuse. He simply stated what he was seeing, and in that calm, factual tone, there was no room left for interpretation, and Victoria's composure, which had held through every question until now, began to fracture, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who was not looking closely, but in the small details, the way her shoulders dropped just slightly, the way her eyes no longer held his as steadily as before, the way her breathing changed just enough to be noticed, and the room felt different now, not tense in the same way as before, but clearer, as if something that had been obscured was now fully visible. And I remained still, my hands folded in my lap, my voice unneeded, because the truth was no longer something that required my explanation. It was unfolding on its own, in their words, in their silence, in the space between what had been believed and what could no longer be denied. And for the first time since this conversation had begun, I felt no uncertainty about what would come next, because whatever was left unsaid would not remain that way for long. Victoria did not speak right away, and in that silence, everything that had been uncertain only moments before began to settle into something far more defined, something that no longer required explanation because it could be felt in the air between us. And Daniel remained still, his eyes fixed on her, not with anger, not yet, but with a level of focus that suggested he was no longer trying to understand what had happened, but waiting to hear whether she would admit it. And I watched her carefully. The way her shoulders rose slightly with a breath she seemed to hold a fraction too long. The way her fingers shifted against the table as if searching for something steady to hold on to. And when she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than before, still controlled, but lacking the certainty that had carried her through every previous answer. And she said that things had become complicated, that there had been decisions made along the way, adjustments that seemed reasonable at the time, her words circling around the truth without fully reaching it. And Daniel did not interrupt her. He did not rush her. He simply let her continue. And the longer she spoke, the more apparent it became that she was no longer explaining but justifying, trying to reshape the narrative into something that could still hold together. But the structure was already failing, and I could see it in the way Daniel's expression changed, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, piece by piece. the trust that had once been there giving way to something else, something quieter, something colder. And when she finally paused, as if waiting for him to respond, he asked her a question that carried no emotion in its tone, but all of it in its meaning. He asked her why, and the simplicity of that word seemed to land heavier than anything else that had been said, because it left no room for avoidance, no space for redirection. And for the first time since this conversation began, Victoria did not have an immediate answer, her gaze dropping, her composure slipping just enough to reveal the effort it had taken to maintain it. And when she did speak again, her explanation was no longer about processes or misunderstandings. It was about intention, about decisions made over time, about opportunities taken because they were available. And she spoke about how easy it had been at first, how the transfers had been in her control, how she had told herself it was temporary, that she would fix it later, that it would not matter in the long run. And as she spoke, I felt a strange kind of stillness settle over me, not because what she was saying was new, but because hearing it spoken out loud removed any remaining doubt. And Daniel listened without interruption, his face unreadable now, his posture still, absorbing each word without reacting to it. And when she finished, when the last of her explanations settled into the quiet of the room, there was a pause that felt different from the ones before, not uncertain, not fragile, but final in a way that made it clear something had shifted permanently. And Daniel leaned back slightly, exhaling in a slow, measured way, as if releasing something he had been holding without realizing it. And he did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He simply acknowledged what had been said, with a quiet nod. And in that moment, the reality of the situation was no longer something that needed to be uncovered or proven. It was something that existed fully, undeniably, between all three of us. And I sat there, my hands still folded in my lap, my voice still unnecessary. Because everything that needed to be revealed had already found its way to the surface, and there was nothing left to hide behind. For a long moment after she finished speaking, no one moved, and the quiet that settled over the room was no longer uncertain or fragile, but steady, almost heavy, as if everything that had been hidden had finally taken its place in plain sight. And I realized then that the moment I had been waiting for without knowing it had already passed, not in some dramatic revelation, not in raised voices or accusations, but in the calm, measured way the truth had unfolded on its own. And I looked at Daniel, really looked at him, and saw something in his expression that I had not seen before. Not confusion, not disbelief, but recognition. The kind that comes when something you trusted without question shifts into something you can no longer ignore. And he did not speak right away. He did not react the way someone might expect. Instead, he remained still, his gaze lowered slightly as if he was replaying everything in his mind. Every conversation, every detail he had once accepted without hesitation. And I could see the weight of that realization settling into him, not all at once, but piece by piece. And beside him, Victoria sat differently now, her posture no longer composed in the same effortless way, her shoulders slightly drawn in, her hands resting more tightly against the edge of the table, as if the space around her had changed and she had not yet adjusted to it. And I noticed how she no longer tried to fill the silence, how she no longer offered explanations or softened her words, because there was nothing left to explain in a way that would restore what had already been lost. And I felt something shift within me as well, not a surge of emotion, not anger or even sadness in the way I might have expected, but a quiet clarity that settled deeper than either, because for the first time in a long time, I was no longer questioning my own experience. I was no longer wondering if I had misunderstood something or missed something or failed in some way to see what had been happening around me. And that clarity was steady, grounding in a way that made everything else feel less urgent. And I thought about the past 2 years again, not as a series of isolated struggles, but as a continuous pattern that now made sense. The absence of support, the careful distance, the way communication had shifted without me fully noticing. And instead of feeling overwhelmed by those memories, I found myself observing them differently, as if they belonged to a version of my life that I could now step back from rather than remain inside of. And Daniel finally spoke then, his voice quieter than before but no longer uncertain, and he said my name in a way that carried more weight than anything else he had said that day. And when I looked at him, I saw not just the man he had become, but the distance that had grown between us without either of us fully understanding how it had happened. And yet there was something else there now, something that had not been present when he first walked through the door, a recognition of that distance, an awareness that something needed to change, and I did not rush to respond. I did not fill the moment with reassurances or explanations, because there was no need to soften what had already been revealed, and instead I allowed the silence to remain, not as something uncomfortable, but as something necessary, a space where everything could settle into its proper place without being forced into resolution too quickly. And for the first time since this conversation began, I felt a sense of control that did not come from speaking or reacting, but from simply being present, fully aware, and no longer willing to overlook what had been made clear. Daniel did not speak immediately after saying my name, and I could tell he was choosing his words carefully, not out of hesitation, but out of an awareness that whatever he said next would not undo what had already been revealed. And when he finally did speak, his voice carried a weight that had not been there before, quieter, steadier, and he said that he should have known, that he should have checked, that he should not have assumed everything was being handled the way he believed it was. And I listened without interrupting, without offering comfort or correction, because this was not a moment that needed to be softened. It was one that needed to be understood fully, and he continued, explaining that he had trusted the system he had built, the people he had relied on, the structure that allowed him to focus on his work without questioning the details. And as he spoke, I realized that this was not just about the money or the property. It was about distance, about how easily that distance had grown between us without either of us fully recognizing it. And Victoria remained silent beside him, her presence no longer central to the moment, but still deeply connected to it, as if everything she had done was now being absorbed into a reality she could no longer shape. And I looked at Daniel again, seeing not just the man who had succeeded in ways I had always hoped for him, but the son who had once needed guidance, who had once asked questions before making decisions. And I understood then that this moment was not just a confrontation, it was a turning point, not because of what had been lost, but because of what could no longer be ignored. And I spoke for the first time in what felt like a long while, my voice calm, steady, not raised or emotional. And I told him that what mattered now was not what had happened over the past 2 years, but what he chose to do with the truth now that he had it. And he listened, really listened, in a way that told me he understood the difference, that this was no longer about explaining or justifying, but about deciding. And the room remained quiet after that, but it was no longer the same kind of silence that had filled it earlier. It was clearer, more defined, as if everything that had been uncertain had settled into something that could be seen plainly. And I felt no urgency to move forward, no need to resolve everything in that moment, because some things could not be repaired immediately, and some things required time, not to be forgotten, but to be addressed properly. And I stood then, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a quiet intention. And as I moved toward the kitchen, I paused briefly, not to look back, but to let the moment settle exactly as it was, without forcing it into something else. And I knew, with a certainty that did not need to be spoken, that whatever came next would not follow the same pattern as before, because the silence that had once allowed things to be hidden had been replaced by something else entirely, something that would not be so easily overlooked again. In this deeply emotional story, an elderly mother reflects on a quiet Thanksgiving dinner that slowly reveals a painful truth hidden within her own family, as her son unknowingly uncovers a secret that has been shaping her life for years, while the daughter-in-law stands at the center of a carefully controlled reality built on silence and manipulation. This narrative explores the fragile distance that can grow between loved ones and how trust can be quietly broken without confrontation, making it one of the most compelling family stories that captures the subtle unraveling of truth through small details and unspoken tension. As the elderly mother recalls her struggles with daily expenses, harsh winters, and quiet loneliness, the contrast between her reality and what her son believed becomes impossible to ignore, turning this into one of those unforgettable family stories where emotional depth is revealed through lived experience rather than dramatic events. The son, confident in his success and generosity, begins to question everything he thought he had done for his mother, leading to a powerful realization that challenges his understanding of family, responsibility, and trust, placing this narrative among impactful family stories that highlight how easily assumptions can replace truth. The daughter-in-law, once composed and in control, is gradually exposed through her own hesitation and shifting behavior, showing how control can exist quietly within a household, making this one of those intense family stories where the antagonist is revealed not through actions alone, but through subtle psychological tension. As the truth surfaces, the elderly mother remains calm and observant, embodying strength without confrontation and redefining what it means to reclaim control in difficult situations, reinforcing why stories like this stand out among meaningful family stories that resonate with audiences seeking realism, emotional depth, and powerful storytelling rooted in everyday life. Character 1. A 68-year-old white American woman with natural aging features and calm expression, wearing simple modest sweater and neutral tones. Front-facing portrait with soft lighting. Realistic skin texture. No cartoon, no CGI, no illustration. Character 2. A 35-year-old white American woman with polished appearance and composed expression, wearing elegant modern outfit in soft neutral colors. Front-facing portrait with confident gaze. Realistic facial features and skin texture. No cartoon, no CGI, no illustration.